One moment she's gathering flowers under a gentle sun, and the next darkness surrounds her. Persephone, the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, is abducted by Hades, her life violently torn apart. What lies ahead for the goddess when her every choice is replaced by someone else's will? This is the story of how the maiden became the ruler of the dead. If tonight's content brings you comfort, click that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we're sharing here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and the time there. It makes our global connection feel even stronger. Now dim the lights, grab a tea with me, and let's ease into tonight's soothing journey. Persephone, or Kore as she was first known, grew up in a world that radiated beauty and warmth. Picture this. Endless fields of shimmering wildflowers swaying lazily under golden sunlight, the air fragrant with the earthy sweetness of blossoms and fresh earth. This was her world, where every step she took brought her to something more enchanting than the last. Flowers of every imaginable color painted the land, blues deep as the summer sky, purples soft as twilight, and golden yellows that could mirror the sun itself. Imagine her there, her laughter echoing brightly as she moved through this paradise, a young goddess untouched by anything but joy. She wasn't alone in these meadows. Her companions, nymphs of streams and forests, danced along beside her. Their voices harmonized in playful songs, filling the air with melodies that seemed to merge with the whisper of the wind. Sometimes, their laughter would roll like soft thunder over the hills, cutting through the quiet hum of bees lazily crawling across clover blossoms. It was a life where her feet never touched shadow, and her days felt like endless afternoons stretching into eternity. But her world wasn't just the field, the sunlight, or even the nymphs. It was her mother, Demeter, who truly made her feel loved and secure. Demeter, goddess of agriculture and harvest, watched over her daughter not just as a protector, but with the tender devotion only a mother can give. To Demeter, Persephone wasn't just a daughter. She was her whole world. Demeter's love felt like a shield, the kind every child takes for granted, a bulwark against any harm. She would braid flowers into Persephone's hair, smoothing stray curls back with hands calloused from tending the earth but soft with affection. Together they were inseparable, a pair whose bond was rooted deeper than the strongest tree. Still, for all its beauty, light, and love, Persephone's life was like a glass jar filled to the brim with sunlight. It appeared perfect, but its fragility hid just beneath the surface. Think about that. Her days were so bright, so steeped in sweetness that it seemed nothing could ever disrupt them. And yet, happiness this complete doesn't last forever, does it? Behind every paradise, there lurks the thin thread of shadow, waiting to unravel even the most idyllic moments. For Persephone, there was no reason to think her life might ever change. She was young, untouched by sadness or fear, and caught up in the simplicity of her existence. The harsh realities outside her bubble weren't just distant, they didn't exist for her. That innocence, though, was exactly what made her so vulnerable. It's easy to feel safe when you've never seen a reason not to be. Persephone wandered with curiosity, but no caution. To her, the world was open, friendly, and hers to explore without the threat of harm. No sharp edges, no hidden traps. She plucked flowers without a second thought, frolicking through paths she'd tread countless times, never imagining this world could betray her, or that somewhere far away, larger forces were contemplating her fate. And it's here, this very trust, is where the tragedy seeds itself. Because even as Persephone laughed amongst her nymph companions and ran barefoot through the fields with petals drifting around her like confetti, she couldn't see the shadows shifting just out of sight. In the shade of the tallest tree, out of view of the laughter and sunlight, someone else, Hades, was watching. And he wasn't just looking, he was waiting. That bond with Demeter? It wasn't just love between a mother and her daughter, it was devotion, fierce and unwavering. Demeter kept watch over Persephone with the vigilance of a hawk. Maybe that's why Persephone, a child so deeply loved and protected, felt nothing but safety in her world. Why question the bounds of safety when you've only ever known care and light? Yet Demeter's watchfulness wasn't enough to stop what lay ahead. Despite her divine powers, she couldn't see everything, and perhaps that was part of the cruel irony. The more seemingly perfect their bond, the more devastating the distance that would come between them. On the day everything changed, it wasn't Persephone's carefree joy that stood out. It was the simplicity of her actions that might seem unremarkable but were devastatingly symbolic. She reached for a flower, a narcissus, a perfect bloom with petals so delicate they resembled spun silk. It was singularly beautiful, standing taller and more vibrant than the others. It caught her eye instantly, demanding her attention. She crouched down to pick it, her fingers brushing its slender stem lightly, the sharp sweetness of its scent floating in the air as she tilted it closer to admire it. But as her fingers curled around the stem, the earth beneath her began to tremble. That tremble, so unexpected, so out of place, stopped the gentle rhythm of the world. It was abrupt, like the first crash of thunder after a long silence. The birds stopped their songs, the nymphs' laughter fell away, and the sun seemed, just for a moment, to dim. Persephone paused, confused, glancing around. For the first time, there was hesitation in her movements, a flicker of unease breaking through the veneer of her innocence. The small joy she'd felt seconds ago, pure and untainted, was jolted from her, replaced instead by a question she couldn't yet answer. That trembling earth wasn't nature adjusting herself. No. This was something unnatural, a force rising up to shatter the balance Persephone had lived in so comfortably. She noticed the flower in her hand had been uprooted completely, its roots dangling exposed, soil still clinging to them in helpless clumps. And when she looked around, the fields themselves seemed less alive, like their brightness had been dimmed. But Persephone didn't know what was happening. How could she? Her world had always been kind, always soft, and she had never once encountered a moment where light didn't fill her path. Instead of running, instead of searching for her mother, she stood frozen on the spot, holding that flower. She couldn't have known that this was the moment her perfect life would begin to collapse. And someone still watched her from the shadows. Silent, unmoving, but deliberate. It wasn't a presence she could feel, yet it pierced the warmth surrounding her like a cold blade. For all her mother's power, all her closeness, Demeter wasn't there now to stop what was about to unfold. That fragile happiness, that perfect bubble, was this close to shattering, even if the goddess holding the flower remained blissfully unaware. Persephone lifted the flower one last time, its beauty still captivating her the way an ember dances just before it's consumed. And somewhere behind her, unseen but very present, the air shifted. It was beyond her, the young goddess lost in sunlight and simplicity, to notice. She was still marveling at the tiny veins running through the flower's petals as the shadows began to stretch toward her. There was no warning in the soft susurration of the wind, no whisper to tell her to look up. What could prepare her for this moment? With one last deep breath, Persephone held her flower, its fragrance filling her lungs. She had no way of knowing this would be the last bloom she'd ever pluck freely. Somewhere near, though far enough to stay unnoticed, was a god wrapped in darkness. Silent as stone, he waited and watched, the moment building like a storm. Persephone stood at the edge of her old life, and with that tiny flower in her fingers, she leaned closer to the world, never knowing it was already beginning to tilt. But in the shadows, someone was watching. One moment, she was bathed in the gentle warmth of the sun, her fingers brushing the soft petals of a flower that seemed to shine brighter than any other. And the next, everything stopped. The laughter of the nymphs, so constant it had faded into the background, vanished. The birdsong overhead turned silent, as if nature itself held its breath. Even the sunlight, which moments before drenched the meadow, dimmed unnaturally. Persephone froze, the narcissus in her hand tilting downward as if sensing a weight was about to descend on them both. You might imagine her looking left, right, up to the sky, but there was no warning in the stillness around her. No flashes of lightning or echoing thunder. Just silence stretching out, heavy and foreign. And then, without warning, the earth beneath her feet began to crack. It wasn't the slow, rumbling sort of movement you might imagine before a tree falls or a rock slides. This was sudden. Sharp. A noise like the earth itself was tearing apart. Persephone stumbled back, looking down as the once solid ground split open before her. Panic came too late. Her feet felt rooted, but not in the joyful way of a child who has bounded across the same field 1,000 times. This froze her, not with wonder but with dread. She didn't know why, but her chest tightened. This wasn't just some small crack in the soil caused by a shift in the earth. The ground was splitting wide, revealing not rocks or roots, but swallowing blackness that seemed endless. Out of that gaping darkness came Hades. The god of the underworld rose in his chariot of blackened bronze, the wheels grinding against the earth as if to scrape away its life, with immortal horses kicking up dust and shadow as they pulled him forward. To Persephone, this would have been beyond comprehension. She had never seen him before, not like this, and his presence was overwhelming. He towered above her, cloaked in a mantle of deep shadow that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was set, cold and unfeeling, the kind of look that you'd only understand as terrifying if it were aimed at you. There was no time for questions. He grabbed her, his hand wrapping around her wrist with more force than she thought possible. In the small window before she could scream, Persephone tried pulling back, yanking her arm away, but his grip didn't falter. The sunlight, her companions, everything she knew, gone in an instant as her bare feet scraped the edge of the chariot when he dragged her inside. The sound of horses rearing echoed through the fields, and the ground beneath them began to cave even further. Her voice finally broke free in a scream, piercing and raw, but it was swallowed quickly. Not by the nymphs rushing to help, because there was no one left near enough, but by the darkness that had begun to pour around them like ink. Her cries were met with the shrill neighing of Hades' horses, the chariot diving downward into the chasm, dragging its unwilling passenger along. Grass, flowers, sunlight. They all blurred into a swirl of green and gold behind her as she reached out, fingers scraping at nothing but empty air. And the earth closed over them both, sealing the field with a clean silence as if nothing had ever happened. Underneath, everything was different. Persephone was no longer surrounded by the singing of nymphs or the hum of bees. For the first time, she felt cold. Not the kind you'd feel on a brisk morning or as the sun sets on a windy day, but a pervasive, biting chill that sank into her skin as if trying to stay there. The underworld was silent in a way that wasn't peaceful. It pressed against her ears, heavier with absence than any sound could ever be, as though the realm itself resented her intrusion. Damp air clung to her, laced with an earthy rot, the scent of things long decayed and forgotten. Each breath felt shallow, like the stillness around her stole fragments of it away. As the chariot descended deeper into this shadowed world, Persephone's terror didn't subside. It only grew, climbing tighter and tighter in her chest. She couldn't see where they were going, only that each turn seemed to bring a thicker darkness, a deeper silence, until her own panicked breathing was the loudest thing she could hear. When it finally stopped, when the chariot came to rest, she didn't feel relief, only the cold stone beneath her feet as Hades pulled her from the chariot. Her captor didn't say a word, not yet. He didn't offer an explanation, a reason for why she had been torn from her life. There was no acknowledgement of her at all, as if taking her was as normal an act as stepping through a door. But for her, this felt like being swallowed whole. Her mind raced, not knowing whether to cling to denial or face the bitter truth that this might not be undone. She yelled, though it didn't feel like yelling anymore, but raw sobbing, demanding to be released, trying to break free from his grasp. Her cries didn't echo back. Instead, they vanished into the stillness, absorbed by the vast, cavernous halls that closed in around her. This place didn't welcome her grief. It didn't respond with sympathy. The underworld watched her struggle with unflinching silence, the empty halls taller and darker than anything she had ever known. What had been stripped from her wasn't just freedom or sunlight, but something bigger, her innocence. In one brief moment, Persephone went from a girl who had never questioned safety, who had never looked over her shoulder, to someone ripped completely from control. Gone was the certainty of her mother's embrace, the light she thought would always guide her. Now, all she had was the unfamiliar weight of her tears falling onto a stone floor and the unsettling realization that she was utterly, hopelessly alone. Hades led her deeper into his kingdom, his world. If the upper realms were marked by their beauty, their vividness, the underworld was defined by the absence of those things. Stone pathways stretched endlessly, ashen rivers slithered through fog, and the air itself felt like tightly packed smoke. It wasn't alive in the way flowers bloom or bees buzz. It felt still, like time itself might grind slower here, where the souls of the dead drifted as softly and silently as falling leaves. Persephone stumbled, dragging her feet along, not out of rebellion, but because her legs had started to tremble uncontrollably. She tried to form words, to demand answers or scream her plea again, but her voice was cracked, hoarse. She swallowed the dryness in her throat but found no relief. Hades didn't stop, and he didn't turn back to look at her. Still silent, still unmoved, his grip on her wrist remained firm but impassive, like she was part of some greater plan he didn't feel the need to explain. Finally, when he released her at what seemed to be the heart of his domain, she collapsed. The coldness of the floor leached through her knees immediately, and her cries began again, weaker but no less desperate. No part of this felt real. She kept expecting the earth to open again, to let her climb back into a world she understood, where the light would warm her skin and her mother's arms would gather her close. But those hopes melted like frost left out in the sun, leaving nothing but the sharp ache of their absence. And so her cries, full of fear and anguish, poured out into the cavernous void. But no one came to answer them. They scattered into the silence and disappeared unheard. But Persephone wasn't the only one whose life was torn apart that day. Demeter knew something was wrong the moment Persephone didn't return. Mothers always know, don't they? It wasn't just about her being late or wandering too far. There was a silence that reached Demeter like a chill wind. At first, she looked in the usual places, the quiet corners of meadows, the shady tree groves where Persephone liked to rest. But when every call of her name went unanswered, it started to sink in. Persephone wasn't just missing, she was gone. The grief hit fast and hard, like the crash of a wave that doesn't recede. Demeter's love for her daughter wasn't just a soft, maternal glow. It burned brighter and fiercer than anyone could ever imagine. And when that love turned to anguish, the world itself felt it. That's the thing about gods. Their emotions don't stay boxed inside. For mortals, a broken heart stays personal, held within. But for a goddess like Demeter, her sorrow bled out into the earth. And right away, it was clear something had shifted. The lush fields where crops stood tall and green turned brittle, fading to shades of yellow and brown. The once fruitful trees refused to bear anything. Branches sagged on the heavy skies, their blossoms falling prematurely into the dust. And it was dust, thick, relentless, choking, that started to take over the land. Even the animals sensed it, their movements slowing as they foraged through barren ground. You've had a bad day before, but imagine how it feels when that bad day is projected into the entire natural world. That's what Demeter's grief did. Her pain was so raw, so overwhelming, that it stripped life from everything around her. Crops that had been inches from harvest withered overnight. Rivers that once nourished endless fields seemed to shrink, reduced to mere trickles beneath the relentless, dried-out earth. Even the wind carried a deadened weight, blowing dust instead of the sense of warm soil and wildflowers. Of course, the mortals noticed. Humanity is always the first to feel the gods' turmoil. Farmers found their fields unworkable, their tools hitting dry, cracked dirt instead of rich, damp soil. Fishing boats returned empty to shore, with even the rivers unable to sustain life. Towns that relied on livestock found their herds thinning, the animals weak and starving as the grasses they relied on turned grey and sour. The mortals, poor things, didn't know what was happening. To them, it might have seemed like the wrath of the gods, punishment for some unknown crime. But it wasn't anger Descartes had brought into their world. It was heartbreak, pure and simple. The stories say that Demeter refused to return to Mount Olympus in this time. She couldn't go back, not with those skies looking down on her with indifference. Instead, she walked the earth in disguise. Maybe it was her way of grieving alone, wandering the lands her daughter once played in, searching in vain for something, anything to cling to. But even as she walked, her heartbreak spread everywhere she went. Human villages she passed through found themselves suddenly cursed with more misfortune, dying seeds, failed crops, sick children. And when she moved on, the people she left behind could do nothing but pray for relief. And still, no sign of Persephone. You'd think a goddess might have a better way to find her daughter, but that's the thing about grief. It blinds, even the divine. Demeter was convinced Persephone must be somewhere still on Earth, hidden away from her reach. Over the horizon, in some distant valley, a shadowy figure must have taken her, she thought. But she didn't know Hades had ripped her child down into the Underworld, where her cries for help were absorbed by the cold stone walls that kept her trapped. Meanwhile, up on Olympus, the other gods were starting to notice. It's hard to miss when the entire world seems to be wilting. Zeus, the mighty king of gods, could hear it most clearly, the cries of mortals reaching toward the heavens. You know how people sound desperate when things fall apart? Their prayers became that, pleading, tearful, racked with fear. Mothers begged for their children's survival as famine claimed their villages. Farmers prayed for water, for sunlight, for anything to save their dying lands. It must have been deafening, and not the kind of sound you can ignore, even as a god. Zeus realized quickly that humanity was in trouble. And here's the thing. Gods might be immortal, and their divine realms might seem untouchable, but the gods drew power from the mortal world. Worship strengthened them. Temples filled with sacrifices kept them thriving. Zeus knew that if the famine continued and humanity fell apart, there might not be anyone left to sing hymns or offer gifts to the gods at all. And for a god as proud and throne-bound as Zeus, that wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a direct threat. So Zeus decided to act. He sent down messages, sending servants to speak to mortals in dreams, but it didn't help much. People couldn't grow food from a divine whisper after all. When mortals turned their prayers directly to Demeter, their words fell into the void. She wasn't answering prayers anymore. For Demeter, everything else, the humans, the seasons, even Olympus itself, became background noise to her suffering. How could she care about the world rebelling against her when her only child had been stolen away? Eventually, Zeus had no choice but to seek Demeter out himself. That's when the truth started to come out. There she was, this great goddess of life and growth, sitting on the barren ground herself, glancing out at the ruins of her once thriving domain. And he tried what anyone might: reason, intervention, promises that things could be made right. But as she recounted Persephone's disappearance and her fears, Zeus began to piece it together. One way or another, he would have to take this issue below the earth, all the way to Hades. But Demeter wasn't some passive figure in all of this, waiting for intervention. Her resolve hardened in that moment, her grief becoming something sharper. The wandering days were over. She wasn't begging Zeus for help. She was demanding answers, standing up from the dust floor of her self-imposed exile with an anger that made the air around her vibrate. If Zeus didn't act quickly enough, she would do it herself, and the results wouldn't be kind. That's what makes Demeter so unforgettable. Underneath her sorrow wasn't just despair. It was pure, unshakable determination. Her child had been ripped from her, but she wasn't going to let that be the end of the story. Her grief was powerful enough to bring humanity to its knees, to turn the earth itself into an echo of her loss. But her love was just as unstoppable. So, whatever Zeus planned, he had no choice but to involve her in it. There was no pushing aside Demeter or calming her with empty words. And no world, mortal or immortal, was going to thrive while the goddess of harvest walked in mourning. As the crops remained dead and the air stayed heavy over the fields, one thing was clear: the answers lay deep below, and Demeter would see this through to the end, with or without permission. But Persephone's story wasn't over yet. Deep beneath the world Persephone had known, past the sunlit fields and gentle hum of bees, lay a place that couldn't have felt more foreign: the Underworld. At first, she couldn't even process what had happened. Fear has a way of turning minutes into hours, where your mind freezes on the same impossible questions. Why me? How do I get out of this without offering any answers? And fear clung to her like the cold of that underground air. No matter how far she looked, the darkness didn't give way. The place felt alive, though not in the way of her flowers and streams. This was a different kind of life, one that hung in the cold, damp silence and moved without sound. Persephone hadn't just been taken. She'd been thrown into a kingdom where nothing would ever feel familiar. The halls of Hades' realm were massive, cut into jagged stone that appeared endless, with arches that reached so high they seemed to vanish into the gloom. These weren't places meant to comfort the living. They loomed, pressing down and crowding around her every step, a reminder that this was a kingdom meant for the dead. At first, she tried to piece together what had even happened. One moment she was laughing under the sun, her fingers curling around the stem of a flower, and the next she'd been pulled from all of it. It didn't feel real. No matter how solid the stone beneath her feet was, she kept wishing it would dissolve so she could wake up and find herself back on the grass, maybe with Demeter's voice calling her from the distance. That hope burned in her for the first few days. But the silence in the underworld didn't budge. And Hades? He didn't offer much. He wasn't cruel in the way you'd think of villains in stories, full of loud threats or menacing glares. That might have been easier for her to fight against. No, Hades was quiet, powerful in his stillness, and unshaken by her desperate cries or even her anger. He treated her less like a prisoner and more like property. That almost made it worse. When he looked at her, it wasn't with hatred or warmth or even pity. It was simply as if he had claimed something that had always been meant to be his. And for someone who had lived her whole life in freedom under an open sky, this was its own kind of cruelty. The first time she tried to leave, it was disastrous. She had no plan other than to run, a natural instinct. And that's what she did. She darted down one of the endless stone corridors when Hades' back was turned, her pulse racing, her breaths growing shallow. But it didn't matter how fast she moved, because the underworld felt alive, as though it shifted around her. Corridors turned into dead ends. Paths that seemed open moments before suddenly spiraled into confusing labyrinths. Shadows clung to the edges of her vision, not just blocking her view, but unnervingly alive, shifting in ways shadows shouldn't. Eventually she collapsed, drained and trembling, realizing there was no way out. Not because she wasn't strong enough, but because the entire place was designed to trap. That was its purpose, to hold the souls of the dead. And now it held her too. Days blurred together after that, though day is a strange concept in a place where no sun ever rises or sets. Time down here wasn't marked by light or dark, but by the way Persephone slowly began to change. At first, she clung desperately to her memories of the world above, recalling every blade of grass, every kind note in her mother's voice, every flower that had ever bloomed in the fields of her childhood. But her memories felt thinner each time she reached for them, like trying to hold onto water as it slips through your fingers. Even so, something else started to shift. She had no choice but to keep going, one step after another, one hollow breath at a time. And somewhere in that numbing repetition, she found small pieces of herself again. She'd never thought of herself as someone who could survive in a place like this, but survival wasn't about what you thought. It was about what you refused to lose. Persephone started noticing the deeper textures of the underworld. Yes, it was overwhelmingly dark, but that darkness wasn't empty. It had layers, soft glows from distant phosphorescent fungi growing along the stone, the faint trickle of the river Styx winding through the kingdom, and the eerie, quiet murmur of the souls who wandered its boundaries. The spirits weren't hostile, just lost. They drifted like scattered whispers, some faltering as though still burdened by the pains of their mortal lives, others gliding lightly, ready to move on to whatever came next. Persephone had been scared of them at first, but after a while she started to feel something else, pity, maybe even compassion. The dead weren't as unreachable as she'd imagined. Their sorrows had echoes of her own, longing, confusion, a search for peace in a place where it was so hard to find. Watching them slowly pulled Persephone outside of her fear, just enough to notice the needs of those around her. Some part of her began to realize that the underworld wasn't just a prison, it was a destination. And destinations needed caretakers. At first, she met their gaze tentatively, unsure of her place or her role in this other world. But the more she walked among them, the more she began to feel it, a quiet sense of duty toward them. They had no one else. Hades may have ruled this kingdom, but he was a distant king, concerned more with the function of his domain than its residents. Persephone, with all her fear and sadness, became the only figure in the underworld who seemed to truly see these souls. And they, in turn, began to look to her, not just as a goddess brought here unwillingly, but as someone who might actually care for them. This shift in Persephone wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy. She still longed for the fields above, for the light on her face, and the feel of her mother's hand brushing through her hair. Those longings never left her. They only faded into the background as she grew into something new. The shadows of this place, which had felt so suffocating at first, now seemed to ebb and flow around her as though they responded to her presence. She walked the darkened corridors unafraid, her head no longer bowed in defeat, but raised with a quiet, growing strength. By the time Persephone began taking her place at Hades' side, she wasn't the same goddess. Her fear didn't rule her anymore, her sadness didn't overwhelm her. She had fought through them both, not by erasing them, but by balancing them with something steadier. She didn't see herself as his captive anymore, nor did she see herself as someone who belonged wholly to the sunlit world above. She had become something entirely different, a queen. And here's where the underworld itself shifted around her again. The stories say she brought life to it in a way no other had before. Not life in the sense of sunlight, flowers, or chirping birds, but something subtler. Small changes rippled through the kingdom. An order, a calm, a sense that this place, for all its darkness, was not devoid of care or warmth. It was Persephone's compassion that defined her rule. Where Hades governed with authority, she balanced him with understanding. Artists often depicted her with that same quiet resolve, sometimes holding a sheaf of grain to symbolize not only her ties to the mortal world, but her role as a figure of renewal, even in a place built around endings. She didn't want to rule here. She would have never chosen it. But whether it was fate, chance, or cruelty that brought her here, she carried it with dignity. If you were to look at her then, this young goddess who had once been carefree and full of laughter, you wouldn't just see someone dragged into darkness. You'd see a figure who had learned to stand in both light and shadow, a queen who sat on a throne of stone not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. And she turned that into a strength. But even queens have their struggles. Demeter's footsteps crushed the dry, brittle grass beneath her as she stormed toward Olympus. She wasn't just grieving anymore, she was furious. Her daughter had been stolen, hidden away in the depths of the underworld, and no matter how high she shouted or how far she searched, no help came. By now, the earth had all but collapsed under the weight of her despair. Crops were dead, rivers were shrinking into powerless trickles, and people so small and fragile compared to gods were starving. But Demeter wasn't focused on humanity's suffering at that moment. She only cared about Persephone. And now she was climbing the steps to confront the one god who could do something about it, Zeus. He must have known this was coming. How could he not? Mortals across the land were crying out in panic, desperate for rain, for food, for salvation, and who did they think held the power to fix it? Zeus, the father of Persephone and king of the gods. He ruled the skies, his word was law, but he'd been quiet, too quiet. Demeter practically burst into the throne room, her fury like a thunderstorm finally breaking. Zeus, seated tall and seemingly calm, barely flinched. Maybe he thought this would go the way of other family squabbles, with a few words exchanged and tensions cooling eventually. But Demeter was not interested in pleasantries or waiting patiently for someone else to take charge. Her voice cut through the room, unshaking. "You did nothing," she accused, her words landing sharper than the crack of lightning. "You are the king of Olympus, and my daughter is missing, taken, and all you've done is sit here and listen to the world crumble beneath you." She wasn't wrong. Zeus had been weighing his options, silent as the mortal world withered and Demeter's fury grew. A confrontation like this couldn't be rushed. It was messy, tangled in divine politics that stretched across realms. But Demeter wasn't interested in the nuances of diplomacy. Zeus leaned forward slightly, his grip on the armrests of his throne tightening. "Do you think this is simple?" he asked, his voice louder but far calmer than hers. Do you think this is something that can be undone with a wave of my hand? Demeter didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her glare said everything it should be, and it wasn't just her grief making her so relentless. Beneath her sharp gaze, there was an undeniable truth. Persephone wasn't just Demeter's daughter. As the goddess of agriculture and the harvest, Demeter's connection to Persephone was tied deeply to the life of the world itself. Her daughter represented more than family. She was renewal, growth, innocence. Without her, everything suffered, from the smallest sprout to the tallest tree. Demeter was relentless, unshaken in her demand, bring her back, now. But here's where things became even more complicated. Hades, it turned out, wasn't just another god acting impulsively. Zeus knew this. He had allowed Hades to act. And why? Because Hades had asked him first. In the myths, it said Hades didn't simply arrive and steal Persephone without a second thought. He had gone to Zeus beforehand, proposing the idea with the kind of quiet, methodical seriousness only Hades could muster. And Zeus, knowing Hades had little companionship down in the underworld, had agreed. Maybe Zeus thought it wasn't such a bad idea. Persephone, after all, would still be his daughter, attached to the family in some way. Maybe he underestimated how much anger Demeter's loss would unleash. Regardless of why Zeus said yes, that decision was now hunting him like a predator stalking its prey. Demeter looked ready to tear the throne from its foundations if he said another word that wasn't useful. So Zeus gave her one thing: action. He promised to intervene, to demand that Persephone be brought back to her mother and restored to the world above. But there was a catch. Zeus didn't reach his rank by rushing headlong into decisions that could unravel the structural balance of the strange little universe the gods ruled. It wasn't just about Demeter and her grief. He had to consider the Underworld, the realm governed by Hades that served as the final resting place for every mortal soul. Hades, unlike Demeter, wasn't causing an earthly disaster, wasn't answering prayers or destroying crops. To Zeus, this made the situation complicated. How do you appease your grieving sister while not insulting one of the most powerful gods in your circle? The answer was compromise, and compromise rarely makes anyone truly happy. Zeus sent Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, to the depths of the underworld to deliver his words directly to Hades. While the mortal world withered above, Hermes descended into the dark kingdom below to face the reclusive ruler who had caused all this chaos. Tricks, deceptions, or riddles, those wouldn't work on Hades. Zeus needed this request to be handled firmly but carefully. Hermes approached with all the grace his role demanded, and when he found Hades with Persephone seated at his side, he made Zeus's demands clear. Persephone was to return. But Hades didn't become king of the underworld by freely bending to everyone's will. He wasn't interested in simply handing Persephone back, not after he had worked so carefully to claim her. However, Olympus's decree was not something even he could ignore outright. That's when his plan emerged. Persephone, quiet and powerless up to now, became the key piece in a game neither she nor her mother knew they were playing. The rules of the underworld were simple but immutable. Whoever ate even the smallest amount of food from the underworld was tied to it forever. Hades knew this. Persephone didn't. And so, he offered her a pomegranate, a small thing, bright red like spilled wine in a world so drained of color. Persephone hesitated at first, her instincts telling her something was off. But after days in this lifeless, cold place, she took it, and before she could realize what it meant, before she could stop herself, she bit into the seeds. A few bites. That was all it took. Her lips might have been stained faintly red, but her fate, that was set in stone. When Zeus's order arrived and Hermes prepared to escort Persephone back to the earth, Hades didn't resist. Instead, he revealed the truth. Persephone couldn't leave fully. She had consumed the food of the dead. The rules of the underworld were clear. She had been bound to his realm by her own action, whether she'd known it or not. The message was simple. Persephone could go back to her mother, but she couldn't stay there. This is where Zeus proposed the arrangement that would shape not only the lives of the gods, but the rhythm of the earth itself. Persephone would divide her time. For part of the year, she would ascend to the world above, free to reunite with her mother and bask in the warmth of sunlight. But the rest of the year, she would return to Hades and fulfill her role as queen of the Underworld. She would belong to both worlds, but not entirely to either. It was a solution, but not one without pain. For Demeter, this was far from the complete reunion she'd demanded. Her daughter would come back, yes, but only in brief, precious seasons. And every time Persephone descended back into the darkness, Demeter's heart would break all over again. For Hades, this wasn't victory either. The queen of the underworld would never truly love him, not the way he might have hoped. But Persephone, for her, it meant something far more complex. She would live a life forever divided between worlds. This cyclical arrangement became more than a family compromise. It became nature itself. Each year, when Persephone returned to the earth above, Demeter's joy brought life back to the fields and the forests. The barren ground thrived, the rivers grew strong, and humanity's prayers were finally answered. But each time Persephone returned to the underworld, Demeter's sadness would weigh on the earth again. It was a pattern born of loss but filled with meaning, a balance between light and shadow. But even as Persephone ascended, a part of her remained below. The first thing Persephone noticed when she stepped into the sunlight was how bright it felt. Not just on her skin, but somewhere deeper, like she'd been holding her breath all this time and finally exhaled. The air was alive in a way the underworld could never replicate. Warm, fragrant, buzzing faintly with the energy of spring. For the first time since her abduction, the world above stretched out before her, open and vibrant, just as she remembered it. But something was different. It wasn't the same girl stepping into the sunlight that had been taken from these fields. She carried the weight of the underworld now, a shadow that even the bright sky couldn't fully erase. Her mother was there. Demeter had waited, her heart stretched taut between hope and grief for far too long. The moment she saw Persephone, her composure broke. She wasn't a high goddess then, not the powerful deity who could green the earth with a wave of her hand. She was just a mother running to her daughter. Their embrace was immediate, fierce, unguarded. Demeter held Persephone like she could keep her in her arms forever, like she could stop time from pulling them apart again. It's said in the Homeric hymn to Demeter's that when the two reunited, Demeter's joy swept through the earth. The barren lands that had cracked and dried in her sorrow came alive again. Blossoms unfurled across fields overnight, and seeds buried deep in the soil began to sprout, as if called forward by her happiness. Trees, fruitless and skeletal for months, seemed to stretch toward the sky, their branches heavy with the promise of new life. Warmth returned to the air, not just in temperature, but in feeling. It was the kind of warmth that reminds you the cold won't last forever. It was spring. The mortals, though unaware of the specifics, noticed the change instantly. Rivers swelled, crops thrived, animals gave birth. Everything pulsed with the rhythm of renewal. It must have been a stark contrast to the famine and despair they'd endured for so long. If you had been there, if you'd lived through those months of nothing growing, you'd think a miracle had arrived. For the humans, it felt like hope had been planted in the ground alongside the crops. They revered Demeter for it, prayed their thanks fervently to the goddess who had saved them from starvation. Of course, they didn't understand that her joy came at a cost. If only Persephone could have stayed. That's the bitter undercurrent running beneath this reunion. Yes, they had found each other again, the mother and daughter who had been torn apart by the schemes of gods. But the victory wasn't whole. Demeter had her child in her arms, and yet, deep down, she knew it wouldn't last. Persephone was no longer hers alone. Part of her belonged to the underworld now, bound by the pomegranate seeds she had eaten there. For every moment she spent walking among the flowers and sunlight again, Persephone knew another moment waited where she would return to shadows and stone. The time above wasn't just a celebration. It was borrowed time ticking down. Demeter poured her happiness into the land as if it might hold Persephone closer, transforming the world's sorrow into beauty in a way only nature could. But that joy was tinged with urgency, an awareness in the back of her mind that Persephone's presence wasn't permanent. Even as blossoms spread across the fields, there was a quiet understanding between them both. They had been given something wonderful, but it had an expiration date. And Persephone herself? She wasn't the same girl who had once danced through these fields with nymphs at her side. Her time in the underworld had changed her. It wasn't the sort of change you'd notice right away, not a physical transformation, but something deeper, subtler. Persephone moved differently now, with a quiet strength that almost seemed at odds with her surroundings. She no longer laughed as loosely or wandered the meadows without thought. The innocence that defined her early life had been carved away and replaced with something steadier. She had seen too much to ever return to the carefree life she once knew. The strange thing is, she didn't come back broken. The underworld didn't destroy her, it reshaped her. Persephone had glimpsed the sorrow of souls, witnessed the struggles of those who lingered in death, and learned to carry a weight that even she didn't fully understand yet. You might not recognize that person walking through the fields now, not entirely. She was still Persephone, still Demeter's daughter, but something darker and wiser flickered in her now. It wasn't a bad thing, not really. She had grown, but there was distance in her growth, a slight shadow in her gaze that no sunlight could fully erase. And yet, there was joy. Real joy. Persephone's return wasn't just an escape from the underworld, but a chance to remind herself of what life could still mean. Walking through the grass without stone beneath her feet, letting the wind touch her face as it carried scents of blooming flowers. It mattered. She smiled when the wind caught her hair, and for a time she could let herself enjoy the fullness of spring. Even if the world above no longer felt like hers alone, it was still worth cherishing. But she couldn't forget where she had come from. How could she? No matter how warm the sunlight felt on her skin or how sweet her mother's voice sounded, Persephone had another life now, one that pulsed to the rhythm of shadows. It was the part of her that couldn't let go of the murmur of souls she had befriended, the weight of her throne in the underworld. She didn't ask for that throne, of course, but it was hers all the same. And even as she stood surrounded by spring's beauty, that throne lingered in her thoughts, waiting for the moment she'd return to it. The world above flourished in her presence. The seasons seemed to reset themselves, as if tied to Persephone's footsteps. Spring exploded into life, its colors spilling across the land as Demeter threw herself into reviving every piece of earth she could touch. There was a sense of renewal that rippled outward, even to mortals who couldn't see the goddess directly. But while the surface world celebrated Persephone's return, she couldn't forget that her time here was counted. Demeter couldn't forget either. They didn't speak of it much. Why would they? Why waste words on something both of them already felt clawing at the edges of every joyful moment? When the day came, when it was time for Persephone to leave once more, there was no tearful goodbye. It wasn't that they didn't feel the weight of the moment, but the repetition of it had taken on a quiet solemnity. Persephone didn't fight it, not anymore. She had come to understand that fighting wouldn't change her fate. The seasons didn't bend because of anger or tears. They simply followed their cycle, as she now did. Her return to the underworld didn't feel like a complete loss, it felt like a shift, a turning point. She carried the light of spring with her, even as the shadows began to pull her back. And so, Persephone walked toward her fate. Her head was not bowed, nor was her step hesitant. She had grown into someone who could carry both the sunlight and the darkness, someone whose life embodied two worlds at once. For Demeter, the earth began its slow descent into quiet once more. Fields wilting, rivers softening, and colors fading to the muted tones of autumn. But there was no rebellion in Demeter's sorrow now. It had become part of the cycle. She knew her daughter would return, just as surely as the seasons themselves. And so, the cycle began. Persephone's journey is one many of us already know in parts, but did you ever realize her story isn't just a myth? It's also how the ancient Greeks explained the seasons themselves. To them, the world's most natural rhythms, the blooming of spring, the dormancy of winter weren't just weather patterns or dull cycles. They were deeply personal, tied to the goddess's life as she moved between the warmth of her mother's embrace and the stony halls of the underworld. Every step Persephone took wasn't just fate, it was a roadmap for how the earth cycles between life and death, dormancy and renewal. When she returns to the surface, the world bursts into life, the flowers bloom, the fields green, and the air becomes soft and gentle. This is spring, when Demeter's joy infuses the land and everything feels new. It's the season humans long for after winter, and for the Greeks, it wasn't just about sunlight or warmth. It was about Persephone coming home. Still, there's a catch. As you know, her time above isn't permanent. When it ends, and she goes back to the underworld, the earth begins to fall quiet again. It starts small at first, fields producing less, leaves browning on the branches. But eventually, we descend into winter, the world's pause. The cycle repeats as it always does, a reminder of Persephone's dual existence, one foot in the world of the living and one in the shadows below. It's such a simple idea, and that's what makes it brilliant. Ancient Greek farmers, staring at empty fields in winter or feeling the first hint of warmth in spring, could see themselves reflected in this myth. They weren't just helplessly at the mercy of nature, they were participating in Persephone's story. Her time spent underground wasn't just about loss or grief. It symbolized seeds buried beneath the soil, waiting. That quiet dormancy wasn't stagnant. It was transformation. Just like Persephone would return to the surface, so too would the wheat and barley emerge from their slumber each season. And this wasn't just a story for farmers. It touched every corner of ancient Greek life. The Eleusinian Mysteries, a deeply important religious rite in Greece, revolved around Persephone's tale. These ceremonies promised their initiates something beyond the hardships of mortal life, a blessed afterlife, regeneration, and immortality. It's not hard to see why. Persephone's annual return wasn't just about the crops. It was proof of a continuous cycle between life and death, offering comfort to those terrified of their own endings. Imagine standing there, part of these rituals, hearing her story told with the weight it carried, and knowing that even death had its seasons. Not an end, but part of something larger, something eternal. It's not just the seasons. The Greeks also tied her story directly to the grain cycle. Think of how grain works. You plant it, bury it beneath the surface, it disappears into the earth. But then it grows again, bursting through the soil, feeding entire villages. For them, Persephone wasn't just a figure of myth, but a literal metaphor for the rhythms they relied on to survive. Her descent, her time beneath the ground, represented that period when seeds were stored or dormant during harsher weather. When she returned each year, it symbolized the promise of growth, of renewal, of life springing back from what seemed lifeless. Here's where her story gets even more fascinating. It's not just about explaining nature or giving people some metaphorical comfort during the cold months. Her tale reflects something deeply real about how life works. Think about it. Everything we experience moves in cycles, doesn't it? The happiest moments don't last forever, and the darkest days, as heavy as they feel, can't stretch on endlessly. Persephone's life mirrors this perfectly. It's not a straight line or a single arc, it's a loop, moving between loss and renewal, death and rebirth, over and over again. It's tragic, sure, but it's also hopeful. Now, let's flip the perspective to the human side of it. The ancient Greeks weren't analyzing weather patterns. They were trying to make sense of a world that didn't give easy answers. Why do bad things happen? Why does winter bring hunger and scarcity? Persephone's story helped them manage that uncertainty. Her descent wasn't framed as a failure or even just an unfortunate mistake. It was necessary. It showed that even the darkest points of the cycle had purpose. Without her time in the underworld, there could be no spring, no renewal. Without death, there could be no life. It's kind of strange to think about, isn't it? For Persephone, her fate wasn't wrapped in triumph. She didn't choose this balance between two worlds, yet through it, she became the embodiment of resilience. That constant shift between light and dark, between the joy of growing flowers and the solemn duty of ruling over the dead defined her. It gave her purpose, even if it wasn't the life she might have wanted. That's something we can all understand, maybe even relate to, finding strength in circumstances beyond our control, adapting to them, and carrying on even when we don't know what's waiting ahead. The Greeks held on to Persephone's story, not just because it explained their world, but because it made them feel less alone in facing it. They could look out at their barren fields, at the snow covering the distant hills, and see more than emptiness. They knew those dead stalks of grain weren't a failure, they were part of the cycle. Persephone's time below wasn't just absence, it was preparation, transformation. And when spring came and the first shoots pushed through the soil, they saw her in that too, a symbol of return, of life's refusal to be contained. To this day, the myth speaks to something timeless. It isn't just about agriculture or gods playing chess with mortal lives. It's about cycles, about loss, resilience, and the persistence of life. Even when stripped of its religious context, Persephone's story still resonates with us. Think about how much of our own existence revolves around letting go and finding ways to move forward. There's a kind of bittersweet beauty in that, isn't there? This idea that nothing stays the same forever, but that change doesn't always mean an ending. Sometimes it means waiting for a new beginning. In modern times, as we pack our histories into textbooks or turn them into simplified explanations, it's easy to forget how much these myths once mattered. Persephone didn't just explain the seasons to the Greeks, she gave them a way to confront the terrifying unknowns of life and death. Her descent wasn't just personal to her, it was personal to all who listened. When the world feels barren and nothing seems to grow, Persephone's story reminds us that even the deepest winters end. Life is buried, not gone. Spring always returns. Even now, when you look at the seasons changing, it's impossible not to see some of her there. When the first green shoots crack through the frost, or the last leaf slips from the trees, it's her cycle playing out all over again. And maybe, just maybe, her story was never just about nature. It was about us too, the way we weather our own seasons, the way we walk between our own light and shadow. Her story may be ancient, but its echoes are timeless. Persephone is one of those rare figures of mythology who can't be placed neatly into a single role. She's not just the carefree Kore anymore, and she's not only the heavy, ethereal queen of the Underworld either. She lives in both extremes, walking the line between life and death, innocence and control, growth and decay. It's no wonder her story resonates so deeply, and has for thousands of years. Honestly, there's something uniquely human about her duality. Maybe that's why she feels more complicated, more relatable than nearly every other god or goddess in the Greek pantheon. Where others stay fixed, predictable in their roles, Persephone changes. She adapts. She balances the impossible. Think about it. This duality is woven into every part of her existence. She's the same goddess who symbolized spring and rebirth, but also sat on a throne of shadows, presiding over the dead. Even her epithets reflected these two sides. When she was Kor, the maiden, she was a picture of freshness and youthfulness, embodying flowers blooming in the breeze and the first green shoots of a field. But as dread Persephone, queen of the underworld, she was all authority and power, a ruler who commanded the shades with calm, unwavering presence. It's a stark contrast, Kore, as the hope of new beginnings on one side, and her darker title as the embodiment of mortality on the other. But the thing is, she's still entirely herself in both roles. One doesn't erase the other. That tension between her two lives is fascinating. But it's not just about her titles or responsibilities. It's about the way she holds these contradictions together in herself without falling apart. Imagine being one person but constantly pulled in two directions that seem completely opposite. For part of the year she lives in the light, surrounded by the world her mother tends, life flourishing in every corner. But then, inevitably, she returns to the underworld, where death rules and nothing grows. It's not like she strolls between two versions of the same home. They're completely different kingdoms, with entirely different energies. The fields above are warm, full of life and movement. But the underworld is still, cold. She belongs to both places, yet not completely to either. And that's really where her internal conflict comes in. Persephone doesn't choose this balance, it's forced upon her. She was never given the option to live in one world or the other, so she's caught somewhere in the middle, constantly shifting between them. That pull between what she wants for herself and what duty demands of her feels incredibly human. We've all felt that tension, haven't we? That sense of being torn between responsibilities and personal desires, or between being one version of yourself for others and another version when you're alone. Persephone just lives it on a divine scale. It's no wonder people are being so drawn to her story. She isn't a one-note goddess or a caricature of power or purity. Instead, she represents complexity. Growth and destruction, care and command, light and shadow, all held within her at once. And because of that, she's inspired some of the most haunting and beautiful depictions in art and literature over the centuries. Artists love a challenge, after all, and Persephone gives them one. Take a look at how she's portrayed visually. In some depictions, she appears soft and serene, carrying a sheaf of grain, an obvious nod to her role with the harvest, her connection to growth and life. It's easy to imagine her with golden light catching in her hair, standing in a field of green. But there are plenty of other depictions where she's shown seated on a throne, her expression commanding, holding a scepter that speaks to her authority over the dead. In those, the focus shifts from her role as a giver of life to her role as a keeper of endings. Even her iconography captures her duality. Artists seem to lean into this tension, refusing to limit her to one easily definable image. How could they, when she so fully embodies two opposing truths? Literature has done the same. Writers and poets across centuries have latched onto Persephone's story, exploring what her myth means in new ways. In Ovid's version of the myth, there's sorrow, yes, but also a sense of inevitability. This acknowledgement that her abduction and transformation are part of a larger balance. In more modern works, like those seen in Jungian psychology, she represents something deeply personal, the idea of descending into the hidden parts of ourselves. Her journey into the underworld becomes a metaphor for self-discovery, confronting the parts of the psyche we'd rather forget. It's not hard to see why this interpretation has stuck. Persephone isn't just moved by outside forces, she grows through them. That gives her story a universal appeal. Because she isn't stagnant. She doesn't let her abduction or her dual roles define her entirely. Instead, she learns to reconcile them, to exist in both roles fully. Yes, she's still the girl who plucked flowers in joy. And yes, she's the sovereign who walks the darkened halls of the underworld with quiet dignity. Both are true at once, even if they seem contradictory from the outside. That ability to hold both extremes makes her a symbol of strength, not the flashy, sword-wielding kind, but the quieter, more enduring sort. And maybe that's why her story endures. Persephone is relatable in a way gods usually aren't. Most gods seem untouchable, larger-than-life beings who act more like forces of nature than personalities with depth. Zeus? He's power and dominance personified. Aphrodite, beauty and love, no messiness in sight. Persephone, though, is filled with contradictions that feel real. She isn't perfect or static. She's caught between roles she would have never chosen, adapting as best as she can. That's what makes her so different and so loved. Her duality also speaks to the balance we see in the natural world. Life and death coexist, constantly cycling, and Persephone is the only goddess who truly embodies that. She's not seasonal in the way we think of spring or winter alone. She represents the entire cycle, the way everything must end to begin again. Her myth reminds us that death isn't just a stopping point, it's also what makes new life possible. That idea feels comforting somehow, even in its melancholy. Over time, Persephone has become more than a symbol of seasons or agricultural cycles. Her story has morphed into one about navigating challenges, about growth that comes from hardship. When we descend into life's unavoidable shadows, we carry something of Persephone's journey with us. Her myth becomes a reminder that we can survive those dark seasons and eventually step back into the light, changed but stronger for the struggle. It's not about erasing the shadow, it's about learning to live with it. So, what does Persephone's story tell us about challenges? Well, it tells us that strength doesn't look like it does in most myths. It's not always about standing on a mountaintop, triumphant, with the gods applauding. Sometimes strength is quieter. Sometimes it looks like carrying two opposing worlds in yourself at once without completely breaking. It's about finding a way to reconcile your roles, your responsibilities, everything pulling at you at once and still standing tall. Persephone doesn't choose her fate, but she makes it hers. That's her power. By the end of her story, or as far as it's been written, Persephone isn't just Kore, the innocent or the distant queen of the underworld. She's not half of anything. She's whole, embodying light and shadow side by side. Maybe that's why her myth has lasted as long as it has. We don't see her as a figure frozen in time, but as someone who reflects the struggles we all feel. Life, death, growth, loss, joy, sorrow. She's the goddess of all of it. And so, her story continues to inspire. Persephone's story may feel like an ancient one, wrapped up in gods, myths, and grand symbols. But strip that away, and what you have is the most human of struggles. It's about loss, losing safety, losing innocence, losing control. It's about finding resilience in impossible circumstances. And maybe more than anything, it's about the painful, messy balance between freedom and duty. If you think about it, isn't that a struggle we've all faced in some form or another? The tension between what you want for yourself and what the world demands of you? Where most myths offer clear heroes or villains, Persephone's tale refuses to do that. Instead, it hands us contradictions, forces us to sit with them and asks, now what? The key themes of Persephone's journey have always been painfully clear. She was a carefree daughter, Kore, plucking flowers in a sunlit meadow. Then she was abducted, dragged to the underworld by a god who decided her fate without asking. But that's not where her story ends. Unlike in so many tales, where the victim remains trapped in their victimhood, Persephone grows. Her transformation into the queen of the underworld, a role she never asked for, mirrors the transitions we all face in life. Growing up, taking on new responsibilities, dealing with loss or heavy decisions you never wanted to make. That silence in the underworld, that cold, unfamiliar darkness, a lot of us, even today, would recognize that feeling. The absence of something you once relied on, the weight of realizing the world isn't what you thought it was. But here's where Persephone teaches us something important. It's not just about surviving those moments, it's about changing through them. Her transition from maiden to queen isn't a rejection of who she was before, it's an evolution. Her innocence doesn't disappear completely, but it's paired with authority, with understanding. She doesn't become cold or hard, even after everything she's been through. Instead, she learns how to carry both light and shadow. That's not a skill gods or mortals pick up easily, and yet it's one of the most essential parts of growing as a person. Persephone doesn't shy away from what she's endured. She uses it, and that's a lesson worth holding on to. If her story resonates so deeply even now, it's because it's so flexible. People have made it their own in countless ways. Take the modern reinterpretations of her myth. Jungian psychologists, for example, look at Persephone's descent into the underworld, not just as a kidnap story, but as a metaphor for inner transformation. The underworld, in this context, could be the unconscious mind, the hidden, scary parts of yourself you don't want to confront but can't avoid forever. The journey down isn't easy. It's uncomfortable, confusing, and more than a little lonely. But it's also necessary if you want to really understand who you are. Persephone's re-emergence in spring mirrors that process. When you finally make it through, you're changed, yes, but you've also found something deeper within yourself. There's growth there, even in the pain. And then, of course, there's her duality. The way she balances two worlds, life and death, duty and independence. That's something that speaks to all of us. In modern times, we've reframed her story countless ways, from novels and art to personal interpretations. Some see her as a symbol of agency, someone who took a horrible situation and turned it into a source of power. Yes, she starts off as a victim, abducted without consent, but by the time she steps into her role as queen, she's asserted herself in ways no one, not even Hades, could have predicted. That's the part of her story that feels especially relevant today. It's not about pretending her struggles didn't exist or sugarcoating what happened to her. It's about acknowledging those struggles and asking how she grew anyway. That growth comes out so clearly in the way Persephone adapts. The underworld, in its cold silence, couldn't be more different than the bright meadows she grew up in. And yet, she doesn't just survive in that space. She finds a role for herself. She becomes a caretaker of souls, the only figure in the entire kingdom who seems to truly see the dead as more than just shades. You wouldn't expect compassion to grow in a place like that, but with Persephone, it does. That's one of the strongest takeaways from her myth. Strength doesn't always look the way we expect. It's not always bold or loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simply finding a way forward when there are no perfect options. Persephone teaches us that survival isn't just about getting through something, it's about the choices you make after, the way you turn your survival into meaning. Her story also reminds us that life isn't linear. The Greeks used her myth to explain the cycle of the seasons, but that same cycle applies to us. Loss doesn't stay. Loss forever. Growth doesn't stay. Growth forever. Every part of life moves in loops, in seasons, repeating, but never exactly the same. Persephone lives this rhythm. Each year she's torn between two worlds, always returning, but never in quite the same way. That's life, isn't it? Constantly shifting, constantly asking you to adjust and adapt. And Persephone shows us how to do that. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but with resilience. Modern audiences can't help but see themselves in her. The sense of being caught between two versions of yourself is familiar to most people. Who hasn't felt that tug of war between responsibility and freedom, between who you were and who you're becoming? Persephone's ability to hold those contradictions together without being consumed by either is deeply relatable. Maybe it's also why her story resonates so much with those going through big transitions in life. Whether it's moving out of your parents' house, starting a new career, losing someone you love, or even just confronting your own fears. Her story feels like a guidebook, even when it doesn't have answers. Because the truth is, we don't always want perfect answers. Sometimes, we just want to know we're not alone. It's also worth noting how powerful compassion is in her story. Persephone could have hardened herself as queen of the underworld. She could have retreated into power, building walls around herself, shutting everything out. But instead, she leans into empathy. She doesn't see the souls of the dead as faceless or meaningless. She gives them her time, her care. Even in the shadowy halls, she never loses her connection to life. And maybe that's the most striking thing about her. She's not just strong because she carries the weight of two worlds. She's strong because she brings kindness into the very places where it seems impossible for kindness to exist. The lessons from Persephone's story aren't about perfection. They're not about erasing pain or turning tragedy into triumph in a neat fairy tale way. They're about what it means to live in the in-between spaces, to hold joy and sorrow together, to confront yourself, your fears, your grief, your messiness, and come out the other side, not as someone healed or whole, but as someone who is growing, who is trying. That's her strength, not in avoiding pain, but in building something meaningful from it. So what can we take from Persephone's journey? Honestly, it depends on where you are in your own. You might feel closest to the innocent core, wandering the meadows and feeling like nothing could ever go wrong. Or maybe you're down in the underworld, struggling in the shadowy parts of life, unsure of how to move forward. Or maybe, just maybe, you're somewhere in the middle balancing light and dark, figuring out how to carry both. Wherever you are, Persephone's story doesn't offer easy endings. But it does remind us that cycles continue and strength always finds a way to grow, even in unexpected places. Persephone's journey shows us something profound. Even in the darkest places, strength can quietly grow. It isn't about escaping the shadows, but learning to live with them, balancing what life gives, even when it feels unfair. Her story, as told in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, reminds us that growth and resilience don't come from avoiding hardship, but from adapting to it. Let her journey inspire you to find balance in your own life, no matter how chaotic it feels. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and your story.